Okay, so now it's time for groundwater lecture number 2. And before we go on, let's talk about what we already have learned. We know there's water in the ground. We know that groundwater is safer to drink than water on the surface, and we know that we dig wells to get at that useful water. But today's presentation poses this question for you. What if we did not even have to dig a well to get at that water? Here are some key concepts and vocabulary that I'm going to hold you accountable for. This is what I'm teaching you in this presentation. This slide will be shown once again at the end of the presentation, and you can kind of self-check yourself to make sure that you have this information either in your head or on your notes in order to be ready for the quiz that is coming up tomorrow.
So what we have here is water coming up out of the ground. This is groundwater that is coming to the surface on its own, and you can see it flowing directly out of the ground there. Well, this is a natural occurrence. This is called a spring. A spring is where water comes up from the ground naturally. And springs are historically very, very important because the water was so clean. There is no animal living underground. There's no pollution deep underground, at least historically speaking. So the water that comes up out of the ground from a spring is clean water, which means you can drink it directly. You don't have to treat it. You don't have to worry about it making you sick and poisoning you. And you can kind of see that here about how clear this water is. It's not cloudy. There's nothing in it that's going to cause you any harm. Well, this particular natural spring is in Gainesville, Florida, and what they did was they built a collection supply, and then they built this waterworks, and they sent the spring water directly to town, because if you catch that water right there where it's coming out of the ground, it's clean and you can drink it. Now once it sits on the surface, you can see it is not safe to drink anymore. That's why the pipe there is going under the ground. So a spring is a place where water comes up out of the ground naturally, and historically they were very important because it gave you a source of clean, reliably safe drinking water, and everybody needs good, clean water. This is much better than getting your water from a river where you don't know what's in the water. So once again, a spring is a place where water comes up out of the ground naturally.
So how do springs form? Well, we know that springs come from precipitation. Precipitation hits the ground and goes into the ground, and eventually it gets to a point where it builds up. But not all rock is the same. Here in this case, we've got a layer of rock which is now not porous or not permeable. So the water coming through the ground can pile up or pool up in places under the ground. That's where our collection of water, our aquifers, come from. But how does it come back to the surface? Well, imagine it happens something like this. The water comes down here, and there's an underground layer of that rock, that impermeable, non-porous rock that doesn't allow water to go through it. So the water kind of when it goes through the ground, it kind of slides, and then it collects over here at a point where it's able to pop back up out of the ground. This is the basic process by which springs form. Here's an example of a hot spring. This is in Death Valley, California, a place where it doesn't rain very much at all. But where it does rain is over here in the mountains. And in the mountains, the water goes down into the ground. And over here in the low part of the valley, the water eventually pops back up again. That's how a spring forms. Now, how big are these springs? You can see in this picture here, springs can be just a little trickle of water coming out of the ground. Here's me drinking from Moody Spring on the side of the road in South Carolina. It's on the side of a rural highway. I pulled over, took a drink, because remember, spring water is clean water. It is safe to drink. Somebody built this pipe coming out of the spring as a means to collect that water, which we know to be good, clean, drinkable water.
So here's another example of a natural spring. This is Lithia Springs, which is just outside of Tampa, Florida. And you can see by the size of this, it's about the size of a small lake or a pond. And what's happening is right out there in the middle, water is coming up out of the ground, and it forms this little pond. Well, water is continuously coming up out of the ground, and when this pond fills up, the water drains and goes this way and dumps itself into the river.
So where are springs found? Well, springs are not rare, and they are found in all 50 states. They can form anywhere where there's a place for water to come up in the surface, because no matter where you are, there is water under the ground. Here's a short list of towns in Georgia near where springs were formed. Sandy Springs, Lithia Springs, Powder Springs, these are all in our area. So springs are not rare. There's about 208 named springs in Georgia alone. These are the ones that are just big enough and significant enough that somebody actually gave them a name. There's countless other smaller springs which nobody bothered to name. Here's the town of McDonough was formed around the what they call the big spring in that area. The city was founded at that spot because people were looking for a place to live. They were looking for a place to have clean drinking water, and they moved to that area, and there was a big spring. There was a big supply of clean, fresh groundwater coming up out of the ground naturally. They didn't even have to dig a well. So, hey, it was a great spot to make a town, and that's why the city of McDonough, which is a little bit south of Atlanta, is where it is, because of that big spring. The big spring's still there today. Cave Springs, a little town up in North Georgia. As the name implies, there is a spring coming out of the ground, but it happens to come out of the ground inside of a cave.
So here I am in the town of Cave Spring, Georgia. As you can imagine, the town got its name because it is a place where there is a spring, water coming up naturally out of the ground, but it comes out of the ground inside of a cave, which makes it a little bit unique. Now the cave is back here. They've actually built a little fort around the cave to help protect it, because this is how the town got their drinking water, and they didn't want anybody to get into the source of their drinking water and pollute it. Any animals, any people, any pollution. You can still see behind me that pipe back there. That's where they take the spring water and they run it into every house in town. That's what they drink. That's what comes out of their faucet. Now they've left this right here, a place where the spring empties out of the cave, and you can come here and you can collect all the spring water you want. There's a container back there which I've collected for us to use in class. Every time I've been here, I've seen multiple people with large amounts of containers just collecting the spring water to take home and drink. Why not? It's free. As opposed to having to go to the grocery store and buy spring water, you can come here and you can get it for free. Some people like the taste of this particular spring water so much that they come from all over to collect it and bring it home. As a matter of fact, people collect so much spring water that right here outside the cave you can see there's a couple wheelbarrows and there's a hand truck that people can use to move the large amounts of water that they will collect here and take home. I just talked to a lady who was from Stone Mountain, Georgia, and we're about almost 2 hours away from Stone Mountain, Georgia here, and she had one of these wheelbarrows just full of these big, large 5-gallon water containers to take home to her house. She swears by this water, says there's nothing else that she would rather drink. So once again, this is Cave Spring, Georgia, where we have a cave that has a spring inside of it that is giving the town its spring water.
Now here's Lithia Springs, Florida, the one I showed you with showing you how big springs can get. The area, the houses in this area, they use this spring to collect their drinking water as well. Now you can see there's people out there swimming around in this stuff, so it makes you wonder, well, how do they drink that water if people are in it? What they do is they collect the water before it gets up to the surface and people start swimming around and fish are in it and that sort of thing. They collect it from underneath the bottom of the spring, and you see the pipes. They got a pumping station. They run them to the houses. Yeah, you can swim in the spring, and so you're swimming around, and then you can actually go and swim over the cave where the water is actually coming up out of the ground. And you can see that they have a grating over there. They have it protected because this is the area's drinking water. This is where they get the water out of their taps from. So obviously they don't want contaminants getting in it. And so yes, you can swim in the spring. They collect it with a pipe down there before you can get to a point where you can contaminate it and put anything in their drinking water. The spring that I showed you in the first slide is actually near Gainesville, Florida. And this is significant because this is the reason why the University of Florida is located in Gainesville. In about 1905, they were looking for a place to build the University of Florida. And a lot of places wanted the university to come there. And Gainesville won out partly because they had this great big natural spring which would provide all of the clean drinking water that they needed to run the university. Think every water fountain, every toilet, every dormitory had drinking water for showers. It was a good place for the university, for the state to build the university, because they knew Gainesville had this large spring that would give them the water they needed to run the university.
So let's talk about a very notable spring in our area, and one that I'm sure you will recognize the name of. Back here, underneath this little grating here, there is water coming up out of the ground naturally. That's a spring. This particular one is called Sandy Spring. Hence the name of the town in our area, North Fulton, called Sandy Springs. People moved to this area and they settled here because they had this spring coming up out of the ground in some nice sandier soil, which made the water not as muddy, so a little bit easier to drink. Well, think about the area of Sandy Springs. This area, people came here and they lived here because they had this nice, good, clean, reliable source of drinking water. They had the Sandy Spring, which gave them good water. Now, we're going to go over here and take a look at it, and the spring isn't so impressive anymore. So here is the Sandy Spring, from which the town of Sandy Springs got its name. And people came here and settled in this area because they had this spring here, which was a good, reliable source of clean water. Now, it doesn't look like much, and it isn't now. The question is, what has changed with this spring? Remember, a spring is where water comes up out of the ground naturally. How did water get into the ground in the first place? Well, it had to infiltrate from rain, precipitation. It doesn't rain any less now than it did 200 years ago. What's different about this area is now that it's all parking lots and roads and buildings and houses. And that means there's so little area for water to get into the ground that it means there is so much less water to then come out of the ground. So springs can run dry. They can actually even die if their water supply is cut down. Now consider where I'm at now. I'm standing at North Springs High School, which if you've heard of this high school, you know where it's at. It's in the town of Sandy Springs, very close to where we are in Roswell. But let's stop and talk about, well, why is this high school called North Springs? It's because there used to be a spring in this area, and it is a little bit north of the Sandy Springs. So this area was called North Springs because there was a spring here of note. Now, that spring is long since dried up and gone. It's been covered up by roads and parking lots and buildings and such. But this area historically was called North Springs because there was a spring here north of the Sandy Springs, and hence the name of the high school became North Springs for the spring that used to be here.
This is Pavilion Springs in Oklahoma, another small bubbling spring. You can see they built up a thing around it to collect the water because this is water that they wanted to use. Now, the state of Florida has by far the most springs, the largest concentration of springs on the earth, over 700 that are large enough to actually have a name for them. And actually in Florida, they probably name some springs that are a lot larger than our ones in Georgia, but they're so common, they don't even bother naming the springs unless they're really, really large. The question is why? Well, there's three reasons. First of all, Florida is down here where we know it rains a lot. Remember, you have to have rain going into the ground, which means you have to have a lot of precipitation. You're always going to have more springs in the east than you are in the west just because it rains more, and that's how the water gets in the ground in the first place. Remember that with Florida, you get a nice, strong onshore breeze every day. You get those, you get the sea breezes, which brings water from the ocean to the land. Well, the land is hot, so that means the water then goes up here, makes a cloud, which then leads to rain. Always a lot of rain in Florida. Second reason, this is what the land in Florida looks like. It is extremely flat. And when water hits flat ground, it's a lot more likely to go into the ground than it is to become runoff because gravity doesn't pull it downhill and make it go somewhere else. Think about this right here. A lot of the rain that hits a mountain is going to slide down the hill before it has a chance to get into the ground. Well, here, all of the water that hits the ground is just basically going to sit there and have time to soak into the ground. This is what Florida is like. Florida is very, very flat. They get a lot of rain. The rain tends to just soak into the ground. Third reason, this is what Florida's ground is made up of. Florida has sandy soil, and we know that water will go into sand very, very easily as opposed to other types of material where the water is a lot more likely to slide off. So Florida has a lot of springs because it rains a lot, the ground is flat, and the ground is sandy. Some examples of springs in Florida, and like I said, these are all places that I visited, and there's almost too many to show you. Interesting behind this one, De Leon Springs. Ponce de Leon was a Spanish explorer who was searching for the fountain of youth, and he thought that the springs in Florida were the fountain of youth, and he was constantly searching for it, and this one was named after him. Rainbow Springs State Park, Poe Springs, you can see where the hole out there in the middle of the water comes up out of the ground. Now, these springs were huge tourist attractions in Florida in the days, especially before Disney. Florida's always had good weather, and people came to Florida, and they actually came there for the springs. Silver Springs Park in Florida is an exceptionally large spring. It's a large lake, and people went there, and they swam in it. They rode boats in it. The boats had glass bottoms in it because the water is so perfectly clear. Because remember, there's no impurities in it, so people could see all the way to the bottom. They could see the fish going around. They could see the caves and that sort of thing. These were huge attractions in Florida in the days before Disney. Weeki Wachee Spring, the really, really, really large, very, very deep spring. One of the famous attractions there in Weeki Wachee is this building over here. They built into the side of the spring, and they have the big windows, and they do a mermaid show outside of the window. It's kitschy, but in the times before video games and even, television, this was a huge tourist attraction in Florida. It's still there today because the spring is natural. You can still go swim in it, and they actually still run the mermaid show. Up and down the coast of Florida, the manatees come in from the ocean, and they winter in the springs because the springs always stay at constant temperature because the water's coming up out of the ground, so it remains at constant temperature. One of the touristy things you could do is actually go and swim with the manatees. Here's a spring inside of a cave in Florida. It's called Devil's Den, where you can go and you can dive down into the cave, and the spring goes down for a lot further than you can imagine. You go hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of feet, and you can scuba dive in throughout the cave. Now, why would these springs be tourist attractions? Well, it's like a free natural swimming pool. Think about in the days before we had, a lot of indoor plumbing and, pools were kind of a rarity. Well, this was a natural swimming pool. You never had to clean it. You never had to replace the water. You had all the clean water you wanted, and the temperature is constant year round. So you can swim in a spring even in the wintertime because the temperature of the water stays the same. Now, Georgia to Florida, big differences with Georgia. Georgia, we have hills, so when it rains in Georgia, the water slides down the hill. It doesn't have the time to soak into the soil as much as it does in Florida. This is also another issue, is that we have clay, and water doesn't like to get into clay very easily. Water tends to slide off of clay as opposed to soak in because clay is not very permeable. So here in Georgia, we don't have nearly as many springs as Florida, even though we get almost the same amount of rain, and it's because we have hilly land and our soil is primarily made up of clay. Now let's talk about spring water. You buy spring water, they sell it in bottles, we get it in the store. What's the deal with spring water? Well, a spring is where water comes up out of the ground naturally. So spring water is water that comes from one of these natural springs. If it is marked spring water on the label by law, you must say where you got it from, because you're saying it came out of the ground naturally. Well, where is that natural location? Next time you buy a bottle of bottled water, if it says spring water, flip it over and you'll see on the back where that water actually came out of the ground. Poland Spring, a very large national company, is right now fighting lawsuits because they are not supposedly not selling true natural spring water, even though it's what they say on the label. They're being accused of not necessarily getting water from specific springs, which is illegal, because if it's spring water, you have to get it from the ground naturally. So what's purified water? Purified water is anything. Purified water is H2O, it's tap water. It could be any source water. It could be spring water, but it's not likely to be, because if it's spring water, you're going to label it as spring water. Purified water is just usually water from either a lake, a river that's been purified, cleaned, put in a bottle. Most of you have probably not seen this name, Arrowhead, of spring water before. It's not something we can buy in the Kroger here. And the reason is because look at its source. It comes from Southern Pacific Spring in Riverside County, California. This is California spring water. So we don't drink California spring water here in Georgia. We're going to drink spring water from Georgia or Florida or someplace closer to us. These you certainly have not probably ever seen, because notice they say spring water. Does say spring water, but both of these I found on trips when I was in England. And in England, they don't drink the same spring water we do. They drink their spring water because they have springs as well. Now, Fiji water. Fiji water is spring water, but why does it cost so much money? That's because the spring where you get Fiji water from is on the island of Fiji, which is out in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. So the water comes up out of the ground naturally. You put it in a bottle, and then you have to put it on a ship. The ship has to come over here, sail through the Panama Canal, docks in Savannah, and then they put it on a truck and they truck it to Atlanta, Georgia. Well, that's a lot of expense. This is why Fiji water is so expensive. Now, why would you pay that money? Well, because some people like the particular taste of Fiji water, because remember, it comes out of the ground naturally. Each spring water has a slightly different taste because it's coming out of slightly different ground. So what kind of spring water is cheaper? You buy spring water from Florida. It's a lot cheaper than Fiji water because it's right there. It's right next door. You don't have to ship it halfway around the world to get it to your shelf. So why would you pay the money? Because you like the particular taste of Fiji water, and it does taste different than spring water from Florida or Minnesota or California, and people are willing to pay the money for it. Now, these two bottles were on the same shelf in airport Minneapolis, and one was $2.75, one was $4.39. Same size bottle. What's the difference? The difference is this one here came from Iceland, which is the same kind of concept as the Fiji water. Iceland's not close. It's expensive to go get the water from Iceland and then put it on a boat and take it to the United States and then put it on a truck and send it to us. This spring water here, even though it is spring water, came from a spring that was local, which makes it a lot cheaper. But you might want to pay the extra money because you like the taste of the Icelandic glacial water. I've had it because I've been to Iceland a couple times. It's good, and to me, yeah, I can take it. I can taste the difference. So why are there so many brands of spring water? You go into the grocery store, Kroger, right over here in front of Centennial High School, you're going to find, maybe 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, maybe 10 different bottles of brands of spring water. That's because each spring has its own bottled water company. Because each spring is different, you have to have different brands. Because remember, each brand of spring water has to come from its own specific spring. So all parts of the U.S. have springs, so you're going to get a company from California, 4, 5, 6, 7, 10 different companies from Florida. You have companies from Pennsylvania. Because all the different springs are in different places, you're going to have different companies, and you therefore have different brands of spring waters. People in California, they are going to buy Arrowhead because that's the spring close to them. Here in Georgia, Crystal Geyser, that's a spring water that's on the East Coast. This one right here is another one in California. We know about Fiji water. So you have all these different brands because there are so many different springs out there. Plus, you can't have just one brand of spring water because there's no one spring that would be big enough to give us all of the spring water for every bottled water that we're going to put on the shelf. Now, let's talk about those different tastes. If you've tasted any of these, especially this one right here, this comes out of Florida, has a very distinct taste to it, which is different than Deer Park, different than Poland Spring. Whether you like it or not, you probably have it in your mind that you know that there are some spring waters that you do not like the taste of, and that's very, very much true. Well, why do they taste different? That's because they have different minerals in them. Remember that this water is coming up out of the ground naturally, and even though there's no contaminants in it, there is natural minerals from the ground, which gives the water a slightly different taste. And by law, all of these different spring companies, they have to print on the label what minerals are coming out of the ground with the water. And it's not bad for you, but if you have some kind of a mineral imbalance or mineral deficiency, they are required by law to tell you, hey, here's what's in the water that comes out of the ground naturally. And not every spring water can be put into a bottle and drank. Some of them have minerals in them that will make you sick, or they just don't taste right. So different spring water bottles, different companies, taste different because of the different mineral content. Now, mineral springs, on the other hand, a mineral spring is a type of natural spring. It's still water coming up out of the ground naturally. But a mineral spring is one where we say there's so much minerals in the water that it really alters the taste. And mineral water is water that doesn't just taste like water anymore. It has a very unique, distinct taste to it. Some people can't taste the difference between Poland Spring and Deer Park and Zephyr Hills. Some people can. Mineral water, everyone can taste the difference in mineral water because there's so many minerals in it that you can taste it. Here's an example of mineral water. This is a spring where water is coming up out of the ground naturally. Water comes up, it builds up and flows outside the spring. This right here is rust. That is literally rust because there is so much iron in the water. When the water comes to the surface, it brings a bunch of iron with it, and the iron gets deposited, and iron that's left outside, especially the water, turns rusty. So this water tastes like a rusty nail. It's a very, very high mineral content water. Now, nobody's going to drink this because drinking rusty flavored water would not taste good. But this is an example of what a mineral spring looks like. Here's one that's a little bit more like what we would drink. This is Lithia Spring. This was in Colorado. And this had a lot of the element lithium in it, which actually had some medicinal properties. People are prescribed lithium for certain maladies. It has so many different minerals in it that the water looks milky. It's not even clear anymore. And there was a time where people would bottle this water and they would sell it, and it was thought to be healthy for you. The guy that owned the spring drove it around the West, and he sold the bottles as a healing potion to people. Now, did it help you or not? We'll get to that later, but this is the concept of a mineral spring. You can see all of the minerals that are floating in the water. It makes it actually cloudy. Radium Springs is the largest natural spring in Georgia. It's down near Albany, and it is also a mineral spring. It has a very milky appearance to the water. Now, you can drink the water out of Radium Springs. It's not going to taste great because the combination of minerals that are coming up out of the ground with that spring water is not pleasant. Won't kill you, but it's not a spring that we would typically drink. In Idaho this summer, I had a chance to visit this area of the Soda Springs area of Idaho, and it's a very famous springs there because they were on the Oregon Trail, and when people were going west to a new life, from the East Coast to the West Coast, the pioneer days, they needed good, clean water, and so there were outposts that people stopped at, say, hey, stop here because you can refresh your water. This particular area has what they call soda springs. It has the right combination of minerals in it that it makes the water bubbly. One of the minerals is bicarbonate, which will give water a fizziness to it, like what we now associate with sodas. There was one of them there that was even called the beer spring because people thought it kind of sort of tasted like lager beer in its bubbliness. They would build little pavilions around them. Here's Soda Spring. People said this one used to taste like lemonade, and it was very popular. You can imagine, instead of just drinking plain water, you drank this mineral water that had a very distinct taste to it. Now, unfortunately, they built a highway near here, and there were some hotels built up, and it cut off the water supply to this spring, so it barely trickles out anymore. It's not really available for drinking. Here is Hooper Spring. Now I circled in red the bicarbonate there. Notice how much higher that bicarbonate is than any of the other minerals, and it has a lot of CO2, has a lot of carbon dioxide. That's the fizziness in sodas. So when this thing bubbles up out of the ground, it's basically naturally carbonated water. Now it loses its fizz pretty quickly as it flows downstream. As you can imagine, like any soda, if you leave it out on the counter, it's going to go flat. But if you catch it right as it's coming out of the ground, you've got naturally bubbly carbonated water. I'm going to show you an example of that here. Where the water is coming out of the ground and you can see it. It's like you opened a can of bubbly soda. Here's Sulphur Spring in Sulphur, Oklahoma. Now sulfur is a very common mineral that tends to come out of the ground. The trick is with sulfur is it doesn't smell good. It tends to smell like rotten eggs, which is not pleasant. I don't want my beverage that I'm drinking to smell like rotten eggs. It's not bad for you, and sulfur is a mineral that we need for the body. But you would go here, and they had this pavilion where you could collect some of the water, and you can see they actually have it written there. All right, here's the minerals that come out of the ground when this water comes to the surface. My son at the time, I don't know, was 7 or 8, he was not fond of the smell of the water because it stunk. It wasn't bad for you, it just had a sulfury kind of a rotten egg kind of smell. Now, the question becomes, are mineral springs good for you? All over the American West and in the East, if you find these mineral springs, typically, and think back 100, 150 years ago, they were marketed as being good for you. Whoever owned the spring would bottle the water or charge people, say, hey, come in and drink some of this mineral water. It's good for you. Now, there's some truth to that, because you think about 150 years ago, pioneers crossing the West, they didn't take vitamins. They didn't have very good diets. Your body was likely very deficient in certain minerals because you couldn't eat all the fresh foods and such that would give you a well-balanced diet like we have today. So you would develop some sicknesses or some maladies that, well, could be cured by a better diet, maybe an influx of minerals into your body. So if you drank this mineral water, you got some more of the minerals, and therefore maybe some of your problems cleared up. Same thing was true of bathing in some of these mineral springs, that they had actually special bathhouses, and the mineral content in the water would help clear up things like rashes. And in a day and age when people didn't take regular baths and didn't have good diets, yes, they were good for you. Nowadays, we eat much better. We're a lot cleaner because, indoor plumbing, everybody has access to a bath on a regular basis. So the answer to this question is kind of a yes and no. Yes, they are good for you. They're certainly not bad for you, but they're not something that makes as much an impact in our day and age as it did to the pioneers 150 years ago. A mineral water will usually say on the label mineral. That's a key that, hey, this isn't just spring water. This is water that actually has a lot of minerals in it and is going to have an altered taste to it. So what about Dasani? Dasani is a very common bottle of water that we buy out of our vending machines. Dasani is labeled as purified water. Dasani is not spring water. Meaning it can come from anywhere, and it does. If you go to California, you can buy Dasani. If you go to Europe, you can buy Dasani. If you go to Australia, you can buy Dasani. You can buy Dasani anywhere because Coke can take, who owns Dasani, Coca-Cola can take water from any source. They can take it from a lake, a river, a well. They can take it from the ocean, take the salt out of it. And if they plop it in a bottle and put it on the shelf, they can sell it as Dasani because Dasani is purified water. Spring water, remember, has to say where it came from. So spring water is a lot more distinct than Dasani. Dasani is water from anywhere. Here in Atlanta, Dasani water comes out of the Chattahoochee River, which is the same place your tap water comes from. Dasani is basically tap water. If you go to California, it's California tap water, which might taste a little bit different than Georgia tap water, but in the end, there's nothing special about Dasani water. It's just H2O from any source. Whereas spring water, to be spring water, it has to come from a specific spring in a specific location. So here are the key concepts and vocabulary. This is what you should have either in your head or in your notes. And look at this, and these are in order in the way the video went. So if you do not have the answer to one of these things, kind of skip back through the video and find that, because this will all be asked of you on the quiz. As a last resort, you can email me and I can help either guide you to the exact right spot on the video, or I can answer your specific questions. Don't say I can't find number 7. Let's ask specific questions, and I will help you get the information that you will need in order to be able to answer that question effectively on the test.